30th of November 1718. The Swedish army led by Charles XII is besieging the Norwegian fortress Fredrikshald. The king is inspecting the new trenches being dug in the night. The royal troops tell their king, "Your Majesty, be careful." The king answered, "Don't be afraid." In 1700, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Lithuania, Saxony and Russia declared war on Sweden, aiming to reclaim the land they lost over the past century. Sweden swiftly forced Denmark out of the conflict in 1700 by attacking Shetland. King Charles XII, leading his army, then achieved a decisive victory over the Russian forces at Narva. Soon after, the focus turned to Saxony, Poland. Over a span of 6 years, Charles effectively pressured the Saxon king August to abdicate the Polish throne in favor of a Swedish puppet ruler, securing a peace treaty. Amidst the Swedish campaign in Poland, Russia regrouped for a renewed assault and seized parts of the Swedish Baltics. Following the peace treaty in Saxony, Charles redirected his forces eastward to confront Russia once more. However, after 3 years of the Russian campaign, the Swedish main army suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Poltava on June 28, 1709, leaving Sweden's future hanging in the balance. Charles narrowly escaped with a small force to the Ottoman Empire, finding refuge in the city of Bender. Despite being safe, he remained a considerable distance from his kingdom in the north. Some historians argue that Charles's exile in Bender inflicted even greater damage upon Sweden than the defeat at Poltava. Seizing the opportunity, former adversaries reignited hostilities. August reclaimed the Polish throne with Tsar Peter's support, while Denmark prepared to attack Sweden. Hanover and Prussia also declared war against Sweden. In the absence of the king, Sweden's eastern provinces fell one by one to the Russian forces. In 1709, Denmark crossed the Öresund Strait with 16,000 men, launching an assault on southern Sweden. Fortunately, Sweden found a capable leader in General Stenbock, who scraped together a new army and repelled the Danish invaders, securing the strait. General Stenbock had given Charles and the Swedish kingdom some respite to reorganize. Sweden could, however, not be without its king forever. The country was an absolute monarchy and thus needed its head of state to make decisions. The Royal Council did, despite this, make decisions concerning the ruling of Sweden. Many times, the king overruled their decision months later. In 1714, the Turks forced Charles to leave the Ottoman Empire, leading to the turmoil in Bender. The king subsequently returned to his kingdom. Disguised as a common officer, Charles rode through the whole Europe for 14 days until he arrived in the last part of Swedish-controlled Germany, Stralsund. There, he remained for several months, attempting to regain the initiative in the war before the city was besieged and ultimately fell. Charles narrowly again escaped capture, fleeing to Sweden by boat. On December 13th, 1715, at 4 a.m., Charles XII set foot on Swedish soil for the first time in 15 years. The kingdom he returned to was a shadow of its former self. Sweden's economy lay in ruins. Famine ravaged the land, and bankruptcy loomed. There were men to gather for a new army, but finding equipment for them was difficult, simply because there were none. Yet again, enemies surrounded the kingdom, including Russia, Saxony, Prussia, Poland, Hanover, England and Denmark. Seeking to revitalize the Swedish war effort, the king launched an invasion of Norway in 1716. Oslo fell swiftly, but the inability to capture the fortresses at Åkerhus and Fredrikshald, coupled with dwindling provisions, forced a Swedish retreat. Following the campaign, the king reunited with his sister Ulrika Eleonora for the first time in 16 years. Gone was the young boy king she had seen off to war in 1700. In his place stood a man in wet clothes, limping from old battle wounds, almost bald, scarred and weathered 34-year-old man. Of the 7 siblings, only they remained. Ulrika Eleonora described their meeting in a letter. The whole evening they sat alone and talked. Charles was deeply affected when she mentioned their parents and their deceased older sister Hedvig Sophia, who had been closest to Charles. There the 2 survivors sat crying. Between them many years of suffering, massacres, plague, hunger, failures and catastrophes for the kingdom. Little remained of the Sweden Charles had vowed to defend at all costs 16 years prior. After the reunion, Charles rode to Lund. Lund became Charles's new headquarters, and soon the whole court was also there. The war situation remained dire. Peter the Great had amassed a fleet and an army of 40,000 men near the Danzig, while Frederick IV of Denmark commanded 30,000 troops ready to sail. Meanwhile, the English navy obstructed the Swedish navy in Karlskrona, preventing their entry into the Baltic Sea. Amidst the chaos of war, a diplomatic masterpiece unfolded, orchestrated by the king's closest confidant, Georg Heinrich von Goetz. Despite holding no official position within the Swedish kingdom, beyond that of the king's advisor, Goetz embarked on a diplomatic missions across Europe, skillfully pitting Sweden's enemies against each other. His efforts bore fruit as he initiated peace negotiations with Russia, prompting England to commence its own talks with Sweden. The negotiations with Russia dragged on until November 1718, with Tsar Peter refusing to cede any territories south of the Finnish Bay. However, he offered Sweden provinces in Karelia and support in conquering Norway if a third party intervened, also ending his alliance with August of Saxony and supporting the Swedish candidate for the Polish throne. Charles rejected this proposal, unwilling to relinquish the Baltic provinces. Nonetheless, Goetz continued negotiations with the hope of persuading Charles to pursue peace. At the same time, Charles needed a new army. This was not an easy task. There were men ready, but not enough money to arm them. Goetz then advised the king to begin a new sort of a financial politics. Goetz also created new official roles within the Swedish state, but he filled all these positions with his own men, increasing his influence. This bred discontent among the nobility and officials, both for Goetz and Charles, mainly because these new official roles came at the expense of the royal council. Initially, Goetz's methods seemed effective as funds poured in, but Charles's intervention for greater results led to economic setbacks, fueling anger across the kingdom. The nobility and officials were too afraid to criticize the king for the whole debacle, and thus Goetz became the scapegoat. But in the end, Goetz's economic politics made it possible to gather another army. At the same time as the diplomatic game and economic planning took place, Charles mobilized the whole country. It was the biggest mobilization Sweden had ever seen. Every part of society took part in preparing for the new campaign. In October 1718, Charles, together with his army, marched on Norway. We're not sure what the plan was with the campaign. Historians assume Charles wanted to force Denmark out of the war while delaying the Russians with peace talks. Then, when he was done with Denmark, he could turn around and attack Russia and regain the lost provinces. The commander of the fleet near Stockholm got the order to gather as many transport ships as he could. This may indicate an attack east would be the next step. Another reason, and the most probable one, was to use Norway as a counterweight in the negotiations with Denmark, England and Russia. Charles had learned from his first campaign against Norway that it was a difficult operation. Charles ordered huge stores of provisions to be built on the border with Norway. That way, the army could sustain itself while also sparing the Norwegian population from further hardships. The Swedish army, numbering 65,000 men, comprised of healthy young individuals from diverse backgrounds, including instances of women disguising themselves as men to join the fight. Despite opposition from the officer corps and weariness among the common people after 18 years of war, loyalty to the king remained strong. Criticism of the campaign was muted, with Geertz often bearing the brunt of blame due to the risks associating with criticizing the king directly. The nobility could not get to Geertz without the king being removed. The French ambassador already reported this in 1715. The desire for peace is so great that there are individuals who wish to obtain it, even at the price of the king's death. On October 30th, the campaign commenced with the Swedish army advancing on Norway from multiple fronts. Charles personally led one contingent towards Fredrikshald fortress, also known as Fredriksten, considered to be the key to Norway, while another army advanced further north from Charles's position. General Armfeldt spearheaded an assault on Trondheim in the north. The Danish-Norwegian army opted to retreat, avoiding direct confrontation. Eventually, the Swedish forces approached Fredrikshald fortress, a formidable stronghold, improved since the previous siege in 1716. Surrounded by high walls atop on a small mountain, the fortress presented a formidable obstacle, necessitating a siege to breach its defenses. On the 20th of November, the fortress was surrounded. Compared to the previous campaign against Norway, the king now brought heavy artillery and a siege expert, the Frenchman Philippe Maigret. Additionally, the old Riksmarschall Reinskiöld emerged at the camp, having been a prisoner in Russia since his capture at Poltava in 1709. The headquarters were established at Tistedalen, on the north side of Tistedalselven. On the 24th of November, the Swedish army started digging trenches toward the fortress. The digging would always begin at dusk, with teams of 200 to 400 soldiers taking turns digging. The first night, they were able to dig 645 meters, but then it slowed down. They were now in the firing range of the fortress, and thus only dug 67 meters the second night and 49 meters after that. The Norwegians could fire upon the Swedish from 3 different positions. They light up the night with fire and light bombs. Every night they were able to shoot 30 to 50 Swedish soldiers. After the first day, batteries were built to bombard the fortress. This in turn led to a breach in the outer defenses. Separating a small outer fortress, the king decided to storm the small fortress with 200 grenadiers. Taken by surprise, the Norwegians tried to flee, but were captured within the fortress and forced to surrender. Impatient with the progress of the main fortress siege, the king spent hours inspecting the trenches, braving the elements alongside his soldiers. His generals asked him to conserve his energy and take care. He only answered that he was younger than them and thus had more energy. Then the 30th of November arrived. The king was supposed to have left on the 29th of November to lead the attack against Oslo and leave the siege in the hands of one of his generals, but he was delayed upon learning of Geertz's imminent arrival. At 2 in the morning, Charles returned from the trenches to the royal headquarters. He spent a few hours writing. At Tistedal, the king was fitted with a new uniform. He did this every 2 weeks. After this, he rested for a while. Then he took part in the morning prayer at the local church. Charles ate dinner together with his nephew Carl Fredrik and a few other officers. Carl Fredrik was living in the same house as the king. The king was teaching his nephew the art of war and life in the field. Charles then took part in the afternoon prayer. Around 4 p.m., he, together with a group of soldiers and officers, rode towards the fortress. It started to get dark. The day was cold, wet, and the digging was to begin at 6 p.m. The Frenchman Maigret told afterwards that the king was in good mood that afternoon, but impatient that the digging had not begun yet that day. The king stayed with Maigret until 6 p.m. After dinner and evening prayer, the king at 7 p.m. returned to the trenches with the intention to cheer up the soldiers who were digging. This night, the work on the new trenches was going unusually slowly, and the work felt unusually heavy for the soldiers. The king became impatient and worried, and sent several officers to check why the work was going so slowly, if there were any obstacles besides being fired upon. Maigret tried to calm the king and said, "Your Majesty can remain calm. Within 8 days, I will deliver you the fortress or my head." Charles only smiled and answered, "We'll see." The dark November night was lit up by the light bombs fired from the Norwegian fortress. The Norwegians continued their firing upon the Swedish trenches, mainly from the fortress and the Norwegian position to the left of the king. Cannons fired grape shots, and musket fire rained upon the soldiers digging ever nearer towards the fortress. To get a better view of the new trench, Charles climbed up to the edge of the trench. To stand steady, he barred his 2 feet into the wall and placed both elbows on top of the trench and was able to get his head over the edge. The king leaned his head against his left hand. From there, Charles could see the fortress quite clearly and the Swedish soldiers working on the new trench. It was also exposed to the great fire from the fortress. The night was cold, thus the king had his cape wrapped around him together with his hat. Down in the trench, Maigret together with several officers stood waiting for the king. Attending was also a man called Sears, who was the adjutant and secretary of the brother-in-law Frederick of Hessen. Sears's presence there was strange. There was no real reason for him to be there. It was now between 9 and 10 p.m. on the 30th of November 1718. Maigret and the officers thought that the king had now exposed himself long enough and shouted to the king to be careful. Their warnings made no difference. The king answered, "Don't be afraid." Then suddenly, the king's left hand fell and his head sank down. A bullet had pierced the left temple and exited through the right. The king's body remained at the edge of the trench. One officer writes that nobody saw if the shot was from far away or close to the king. None of us who stood in the trench could during the heavy fire from the cannons and muskets see or hear where the shot came from. The first of the officers who noticed that the king was dead was the officer Kalbars. He patted Officer Kallberg on the shoulder and shouted, "Lord Jesus, the king is shot." Charles XII died at the age of 36. Voltaire, who had talked to Maigret and others close to the king, wrote that Maigret would have said, "The play is over, let us go and eat dinner." The king's body was placed on a stretcher and was covered by 2 coats. Sears removed the king's hat and placed a white wig to cover the king's face. This was done to cover the king's death, as he was known for not wearing a wig. During the way to the royal headquarters, the capes and the wig fell off the king. The soldiers who carried the stretcher recognized the king straight away. They were ordered not to say anything to anyone. They carried the corpse to the headquarters and into the king's chambers. The king was soon placed on a table in the house. Later the king was escorted by the royal guard to Uddevalla, where he was embalmed. At the new year, 1718 to 1719, a black wagon with a coffin rolled towards Stockholm. The king was buried on the 26th of February in Riddarholmskyrkan. But one question remains: who shot the king? During Charles's life, he was always near the danger and thus at a high risk of getting shot. After the Battle of Narva, 1700, a bullet missed his throat by only a few centimeters, which he discovered when he unrolled his scarf in the evening. Before the Battle of Poltava, he was shot in the left foot. In Bender, a bullet touched his eyebrow. In 1715, a musket shot hit his chest and Charles fainted. Only a few months before the siege, Charles was hit by a bullet on the cheek, and the last bullet took his life. It's not surprising that Charles, who was always engaging in battle and storming fortresses, would eventually fall to an enemy bullet. And thus, a Norwegian bullet seems to be the most likely case. But is that really what happened on the 30th of November? Was Charles shot by an enemy bullet? Only judging the written material, we cannot make the judgment. All the witnesses wrote down their memory of the event years after the night, but we still have the uniform of Charles. You can still see the mud from the trenches, most on the left side, which indicates that the king was leaning and later fell on the left side. The hat has a hole, which shows a projectile size of 19.5 millimeters. Another evidence is the king's body. The sarcophagus has been opened on 4 different occasions. It was first opened in 1746 by 3 men who only visually inspected the buried body and had no value for science. They described the body as unchanged since its burial. Next time the tomb was opened was in 1799. King Gustav IV Adolf wished to see his idol and if Charles looked like the portrait he owned. The third time the tomb was opened was in 1859, and this time it was in the name of science. The last time was in 1917, and it was the most thorough examination of the two. The scientists measured, photographed, and x-rayed the king's remains. The king wore white simple shirts together with white gloves. He was bald from the front of the head and almost to the back, with only hair on the sides. It still had its original color. The teeth were worn down by several years of hard food. He was 178 centimeters tall, which was tall for the time. Studies confirmed that the king was shot by a round projectile with a diameter of 18 to 20 millimeters. It hit the left temple and passed out on the other side. The bullet must have had a great force to create the damage. This may indicate that the king had been shot from a close range, but the examiners only confirmed that a close shot was not to be excluded from the possible solution to the king's death. But where had the shot come from? Close or far away? A shot from far away guarantees that it would have been an enemy bullet. The enemy was at least at a distance of 225 meters. That was the distance from the main fortress. To the other parts of the fortress was even further away. If the bullet came from a short distance, it becomes more problematic. A short distance indicates that the shot came from Charles's own lines, an assassination. Most research concluding that one of Charles's own soldiers or officers would have done this seemed too far-fetched. To find out who shot the king, we need to know what kind of a projectile and with what kind of weapon fired the shot. The first conclusion that can be made is that the bullet cannot have been of lead. The X-ray showed no traces of lead in the skull, but it showed remains of lead in the foot, which confirms the gunshot injury Charles had received in 1709. That leaves us with 2 options. Either it was a bullet of iron, or it was a specially made projectile. An iron bullet was not used for muskets, but could be used for cannons. However, the Norwegians used iron bullets, but with a larger diameter than that of the hole in the king's hat and skull. That leaves us with the last option, a special made projectile. This was either made with a mantle-covered bullet or a bullet made of hard metal, for example bronze, brass or silver. There is a story that Charles was shot by a bullet from a button from his old coat, but science discards this, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. It cannot have been a Norwegian musket. Those muskets had a diameter of 16.5 to 17.3 millimeters. but the Swedish army used bullets with a diameter of 18 to 19 millimeters. There are those who say a cannon fired the shot, a grape shot, which is a collection of small bullets loaded in the cannon, like a shotgun. There have been tests made to examine this theory, but the evidence has been discarded also by a number of scientists. In 1998, the X-ray pictures were examined. It resulted in a conclusion that a shot from a short distance was the most likely. This is supported by other research made at the time. But if the king was assassinated, who would gain the most from this? The king never proclaimed an heir. Gertz, Charles's nephew Carl Frederick, and their followers were dependent on Charles's power as king and his personal support. Their positions of power stood and fell with the king. The new peace negotiations with Russia was rumored to have had a clause that Carl Frederick was supposed to marry Tsar Peter's daughter as a sign of peace between Russia and Sweden, and that would secure the throne for Carl Frederick. So, it was not the supporters of Carl Frederick. There was another group who would gain from the king's death. They were also working in secret on a new constitution to end the Swedish absolutism. The ones who would gain the most from the king's death were Charles's brother-in-law, Frederick of Hessen, and his followers. With the king gone, they could get rid of Gertz, and in that way remove Carl Frederick's support for the throne, and this secured the throne for Charles's sister and Frederick's wife, Ulrika Eleonora, and later his position as king. With the rumor of the Russian peace clause, and that Gertz were to arrive within a day or two, time was of the essence. Frederick of Hessen had presented Ulrika Eleonora with an instruction in case of the death of Charles. Never during 18 years of warfare had such instructions been written by anyone. The contrast between Frederick of Hessen and Carl Frederick is striking. The 18-year-old Carl Frederick was paralyzed by grief and sorrow, while Frederick of Hessen wasted no time putting his plan into action. On the night of December the 1st, Sears was sent to Stockholm with the news of the king's death. Sears brought the news to Ulrika Eleonora, who used the instructions given to her by Frederick of Hessen. All Gertz's men in power were arrested, and so was Gertz. Frederick had no legal right to do any of this. The 1st of December, Frederick of Hessen gathered all the officers to a war council. He proclaimed that he, like all the officers, was against the campaign against Norway, and had tried everything to make Charles not to go through with it. He now took charge, lifted the siege, and the campaign ended. The 3rd of December, the army marched away. The highest officers left as soon as they could, having been bribed by Frederick of Hessen by a total sum of 100,000 riksdaler from the war chest. And there was no legal support for this action. The men and officers were left on their own. The official reason for the payment was to compensate for the trouble and humiliations that the officers had endured during the campaign. It was a bribe to make Ulrika Eleonora queen. In a swift action, Frederick of Hessen had deprived the supporters of Carl Frederick of their power positions by hitting against Gertz and then against his people in Stockholm. Carl Frederick was no longer in the game for the Swedish throne. Ulrika Eleonora was queen for 13 months before she abdicated in favor of her husband, now King Frederick. So, much speaks for the fact that the king was assassinated. But who had fired the shot? One officer, Hultmann, wrote that the king had been shot by an enemy bullet. Another officer, Kronstedt, supposedly said at his deathbed that he had loaded the murder weapon and handed it to Royal Guard corporal who fired the shot. But this is not likely. Another unlikely scenario is that Frederick of Hessen would have fired the shot. Frederick was too far away in the headquarters, but he could have hired someone, although direct evidence does not exist. However, there are indications pointing in a certain direction. Remember the officer Sears from the trench, the adjutant and secretary to the Frederick of Hessen. During the night in the trench, he could easily have slipped away and fired the shot. There were many spots near the king where nobody would have seen him, and then quickly returned to place his wig over the king and confirm his kill. In 1723, when Sears had a high fever and was delirious, he had thrown open the window in his apartment in Stockholm and shouted that he had killed the king. He continued that he had done it to help the new King Frederick to gain the throne. When Sirs regained his health, he retracted the statement. Certain parts of the government tried and failed to contain the rumor from spreading. At the same time, an ex-lieutenant claimed that Sirs had gotten 3,000 to 5,000 ducats as a reward for killing the king. In an attempt to cool down the rumor, now King Frederick sent a man to siege Officer Maigret in France to get his testimony. Most likely for affection for his countrymen, he said that the bullet must have been fired from something that could not be carried by a single man. But he told nothing that could act as an alibi for Sirs. Fully convincing evidence will never be recovered about Sirs's part in the death of Charles. But a lot of evidence points that he did it on behalf of Frederick of Hessen. So, with that being said, many questions remain. But during all this, Charles XII was sleeping undisturbed of what played out after his death. In the calmness of his sarcophagus, in an everlasting peace, he remains one of the last great kings in Sweden's history.